Welcome to The Explainer. We're always told that our political divides are about policy or about party loyalty. But what if the real conflict is much, much deeper? Today, we're diving into a fascinating paper that makes a really provocative claim. The real war is happening over the meaning of the words we use to define America's core principles.
So let me just ask you this, right at the top. What happens when the words we all think we know, words like liberty, justice, and rights, don't mean the same thing to everybody anymore? What if we're all using the same vocabulary, but we're actually speaking completely different languages? And according to the source we're looking at, the stakes could not be higher. It brings up this quote from James Wilson. This guy was one of the key architects of the U.S. Constitution. And his point, way back in 1790, was that a shared understanding of our principles isn't just a nice to have. It's the absolute bedrock a nation needs to survive. And that leads us right into the paper's central idea, a war over words. The authors argue that all the instability and confusion we feel in our public debates, well, that's not an accident. They frame it as the result of a long and pretty deliberate effort to change the very meaning of our political language. So what does this war on meaning actually look like? The paper uses this phrase, metaphysical distortion. Now, I know, that sounds super academic, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple and powerful. It's the idea that our most important words have been cut loose from any objective, real-world anchor. And once they're unmoored like that, well, they can be redefined by anyone for literally any purpose. Okay, so how did this happen? The paper argues it all boils down to a clash between two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world itself. And here they are. Think of them as the two opposing teams in this war on meaning. On the left, you've got the view the paper calls metaphysical realism, which it attributes to the American founders. The core idea here is that concepts like justice or liberty are real. They're grounded in nature and they exist outside of our own minds. Then, on the right, you have what the paper calls anti-realism. This is the idea that those same concepts are just useful human inventions, social constructs. Truth isn't fixed. It's whatever a society agrees is useful or whatever the people in power say it is. According to this paper, this right here is the fundamental fault line in our entire political conversation. So how does this pretty abstract philosophical fight actually play out in the real world? Well, the paper gets very specific with something it calls the lost lexicon. It breaks down how our key political terms end up with completely different definitions depending on which of those two worldviews you're starting from. All right, first up, a big one, justice. From the realist perspective, as the paper lays it out, justice is a moral virtue. It's all about giving each person what they are properly owed. And the key thing is that what they are owed is determined by a permanent, unchanging natural law. It's stable. Now, look at the contrast. The paper calls the modern view a distortion. Here, justice isn't about a stable moral virtue. It's a tool for redistribution, aimed at correcting what are seen as social grievances. And, this is crucial, what counts as just is always changing. It's perpetually updated based on the political and cultural mood of the moment. Next up, rights. In the realist view described in this paper, your rights are inherent. You have them because you're human. They come from nature or God, not from the government. That makes them pre-political, meaning they exist before any government is ever formed. The government's only job is to protect the rights you already have. The modern view, as the paper presents it, just flips this completely on its head. Here, rights are not inherent, they're entitlements granted by the state. And that difference is absolutely massive, because if the state can grant you a right, it means the state can also change that right or even take it away, depending on what's seen as useful or politically necessary at the time. And what about law itself? In this traditional realist framework, a law isn't just whatever a ruler says. It has to be an ordinance of reason that serves the common good. And this leads to a pretty stunning conclusion. If a man-made law goes against that higher natural law, it's not even considered a real legitimate law at all. But the modern view described in the paper separates law from morality completely. Law is just the will of whoever's in power. It's a tool for policy, and as long as the right boxes were checked and the right procedures were followed, its connection to any deeper truth or justice is basically considered irrelevant. The paper then argues that underneath all of these individual definitions, happens, there's an even bigger, more foundational idea that's been lost. It's a concept the authors claim was the real spiritual glue of the American project. And that idea is a national covenant. So what in the world is a covenant? Well, it's not just a contract. The source defines it as a profoundly moral agreement. It's a promise made not just between people, but in the presence of a divine witness. And that creates these shared, lasting obligations that are supposed to be the bedrock of the whole society. Yeah, this slide really lays out the difference perfectly. A contract is practical, right? It's based on mutual benefit, it's utilitarian, and you can dissolve it when it's no longer useful. But a covenant? That's something else entirely. It's theological. Its authority comes from a higher power, and its obligations are meant to last. The paper's big argument here is that America was originally seen as a sacred covenant, not just some practical, disposable contract. So this all brings us to the paper's final, pretty sobering conclusion. If our most important words have been redefined and the whole idea of a binding covenant has been forgotten, what happens next? The paper's answer is blunt. Language itself becomes the main battlefield. Now, the paper doesn't suggest this change happened overnight or by accident. It actually pinpoints a whole sequence of philosophical movements that it claims were responsible for chipping away at that original realist foundation, ultimately leading to the linguistic chaos it describes today. And here are the intellectual movements the paper says are responsible. It kind of walks through them like falling dominoes. First, it points to nominalism, which is the idea that our words are just arbitrary labels, and that basically cut the cord between language and reality. Then it says pragmatism came along and changed the definition of truth itself, arguing that truth is just whatever works. After that, constructivism, which argues that our values aren't discovered as eternal truths, they're just invented by us, created by society. And finally, the paper says progressivism took that idea and ran with it, essentially making historical change itself the new moral compass, replacing any idea of permanent truth. Each step, according to the source, just pushed the goalposts further and further away. And this all builds to the paper's final, powerful takeaway. The struggle for the country's future isn't just happening in Washington, D.C. or on traditional battlefields. The real conflict, it argues, is taking place in our dictionaries, in our classrooms, and in every public debate. The battlefield of our time is language itself. So the paper's call to action is actually a pretty simple one when you think about it. It says that if we want to defend things like liberty and justice, we have to start with an act of memory. We first have to remember what those words were supposed to mean in the first place. And that leaves us with a final, really provocative question to think about. If this paper is right, and the meaning of our words really is a battlefield, who gets to draw the map? Who decides what these essential words will mean for the next generation? That's it for this explainer. Thanks for tuning in.